Now that the affirmative team has presented their plan, the reasons for their plan, and the advantages of their plan, it's time for the first negative constructive to stand up and present 8 minutes of strategic responses that will disprove the merits of the affirmative. In today's video, we'll examine the strategic options available to the 1NC and see how to build a strong first negative constructive that sets up the negative positions for the rest of the round. Before we jump into the content of the 1NC, I want to take a moment to explain how important the first cross-examination is. I'll assume that you are the 1N, which means your partner has 3 critical goals for the cross-examination. First, the cross-ex really needs to last the entire 3 minutes, because the moment the cross-ex ends, your prep time begins, and you'll already be pressed for time. Second, you need to make sure that both of you truly understand the entire affirmative plan. Not only could clarifying questions in the cross-examination help you fill your full 3 minutes, but also those questions help you identify the weaknesses in the 1AC. You never know when a simple question about how the plan works, who enacts the plan, or how the plan achieves the advantages might expose a hole in the affirmative plan. So don't be afraid to dig deep and ask as many follow-up questions as necessary. The third goal of cross-examination is to set up your negative positioning. At first, you and your partner might not be able to read each other's minds, but you'd be surprised how quickly you learn to depend on each other. And cross-examination is a perfect time for your partner to be asking questions that set the stage for your arguments. Okay, now that we've discussed the importance of the cross-ex, let's look at the 1NC itself. There are 2 categories of arguments in the 1NC. Case arguments and off-case arguments. A case argument is a defensive argument that responds directly to a claim made in the 1AC. Let's say the 1AC claims that the federal government recently increased its investment in drones. You could have evidence that shows that the federal government did not increase its investment in drones, or maybe you have evidence to show why the government wisely increased its investment. In other words, the affirmative said something is true, and you as the negative team want to say that either it's not true or there's an important reason why it's true. Off-case arguments are offensive arguments, which means they move the ball into negative territory. You should have several off-case arguments to ensure that the ball moves as deeply into negative territory as possible. You can't be sure at the start of the round which offensive arguments move the ball furthest into the judge's mind, so your goal in the 1AC is to use defense to bring the ball back to the starting line and offense to carry the ball back into negative territory as much as possible. Okay, so now you know the difference between a case argument and an off-case argument. Let's take a look at how to assemble your 1NC. In the world of debate, off-case arguments almost always come first in the 1NC. There are 2 reasons for this. First, arguments like topicality and critiques are a priori issues, which means they trump all other arguments in the round, and they should be theoretically decided before any other issues. That's the equivalent of deciding whether you're in the right courtroom before deciding whether the defendant is guilty. So it needs to occur first. Of course, in the world of debate, the judge doesn't actually stop to announce that decision mid-round, but logically speaking, you would be asking the judge to consider the argument first when making a decision at the end of the round. The second reason that an off-case argument usually comes first is because you want the off-case argument to be the first argument in the judge's mind. Consider this. The affirmative team claims that wiretapping is a problem and that the federal government should cease the use of warrantless wiretaps. Your case arguments might show that warrantless wiretapping is already on the decline, but the effectiveness of these arguments is limited because they only set the ball back to the starting line. However, a terrorism disad that shows that eliminating warrantless wiretaps makes us more susceptible to a terrorist attack would put the ball squarely in negative territory, and would do so without even having to make the case arguments. So offensive arguments need to be presented first. You'll also want to prioritize your off-case arguments. Generally speaking, topicality always gets presented first, no matter what. Critiques are second, disads are third, counterplans are last. Of course, you can change the order of critiques, disads, and counterplans depending on your strategy and the nature of the arguments themselves. But if you don't have any reason to mess with the order, then use the order I just described. Once you're finished constructing your off-case arguments, it's time to turn to your case arguments. Case arguments are the defensive arguments that answer the arguments made in the 1AC. In most cases, you can answer the arguments in the same order that the affirmative team presented them. So if their first contention is inherency, you can answer inherency first, then solvency, then advantages. But you can also choose to mix up the order if you are running short on time and want to be sure to get to specific arguments. The amount of time you spend on each case argument varies from round to round, and it also depends on how much time you spend making your off-case arguments. If you spend 5 minutes running topicality, disads, and counterplans, that's only 3 minutes you'll have to answer affirmative arguments such as inherency, solvency, harms, and advantages. But maybe you didn't have that many off-case arguments. So now you get to spend more time trying to disprove the arguments made in the 1AC. So let's look at how much emphasis you should put on each argument. And that depends on how important it is to win that argument. Here's what I mean. You know that the affirmative team has the burden of proof. That means that they must prove that their plan is inherent, that it solves for all the harms, and that it's topical. But unlike the affirmative team, the negative team doesn't need to win all three arguments to win the round. Therefore, and this is important, the 1NC doesn't have to go for the kill on every argument. In other words, the negative team doesn't have to win inherency, but the affirmative team does. And the negative team doesn't need to win topicality or solvency either, but the affirmative team does. Instead, the negative team has the burden of clash. This simply means that the negative team is responsible for providing at least one argument that disproves or attempts to disprove the affirmative case. For example, think of a house of cards built by the affirmative team. The affirmative team has to get every card positioned perfectly, but the negative team only has to knock out one card for the entire structure to fall. So let's go back to the 1NC and our case arguments. It might not be necessary for the 1NC to focus heavily on inherency, for example. In fact, the first negative speaker might spend almost no time debating inherency at all. Now, I'm not suggesting that you drop or kick all of the arguments you don't care about. You need to respond to all of the affirmative arguments, even if your responses are minimal. Spending 20 seconds on inherency means that you've at least done something with the argument. It doesn't mean you'll win that argument, but nobody can accuse you of dropping that argument either. Of course, the opposite of this is true. If you really want to focus the judge's attention on an argument you think you are winning, you want to spend more time on that argument. If, for example, you don't think the proposed plan solves the problem, you should spend more time reading evidence, adding new subpoints, and providing more analysis to prove your point. Now, let's spend a bit of time talking about answering advantages. There is a recent trend in the world of debate to combine solvency, harms, and advantages all into the advantage structure. Previously, affirmative teams would say something like, inherency, we have lots of drones. Harms, drones are invading our privacy. Plan, no more drones. Solvency, we restore privacy. Advantages, more privacy means a happier nation. As you can see, there's some degree of redundancy from one argument to the next. So many cases now look like this. Inherency, we have lots of drones. Plan, no more drones. Advantage, drones increase happiness. Subpoint 1, drones invade privacy. Subpoint 2, eliminating drones restores privacy. Subpoint 3, more privacy means a happier nation. Of course, you're making the same argument, but you're packaging the argument a little differently. And as the 1NC, you can adjust your case responses accordingly. Okay, so that's case and off-case arguments. The bottom line is that for every argument made by the 1AC, you should have an argument in the 1NC, and you should make a whole lot of new arguments. But here's the deal, and you should hear me say this loud and clear. None of this matters if you don't understand the files you brought with you to the tournament. You might have thousands of pages of evidence that you downloaded from a debate website or that your varsity debaters gave to you before the tournament. But if you don't know what's in your files, you can't possibly know your strategic options for your 1NC. So Monday through Friday, you really must read your files and understand your arguments. When you do this, you'll hear affirmative arguments on Saturday and know exactly what to say. Okay, so that's it for the 1NC. Make sure you know the difference between case and off-case arguments and how each of them functions in the 1NC. That's all for now, debaters. Good luck.